So firstly, I'd like to welcome you all to the latest in our series of policy discussion events. This one is entitled Georgia's Policy on its Occupied Regions and Beyond. My name is Alex Scrivener. I'm here in two overlapping capacities today, the first of which is as manager of the Eurasia Democratic Security Network, and those of you who are regulars at our meetings may notice there was an additional logo in the promotional material this time round, and the second of my overlapping capacities is that of executive director of the newly established organization Democratic Security Institute. So to give you some organizational context about EDSN and DSI, EDSN is a long-standing NED, and it aims to bring together a disparate and varied group of professionals, diplomats, political practitioners, scholars from across the Eurasian region to discuss and explore the concept of democratic security, which is looking at the complex interlinkages between democracy and democratization on the one hand, and security and security policy, both hard and soft, on the other. Those two worlds having often been rather siloed in the policy world until this point. But this project has been so successful and it's been growing so well that we decided as EDSN to spin off as a separate organization, namely Democratic Security Institute, to allow us to pursue a wider range of activities, and hence DSI. So on that note, very few issues are as relevant to the issue of democratic security as the Georgian unresolved conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And before I move on to our two very esteemed guests and speakers today, I'd like to quickly explain why we chose this subject to discuss now. So those of you who maybe don't work on the Georgian conflicts as part of their sort of daily jobs or part of their lives may be forgiven for thinking that perhaps not much has happened on these conflicts since 2008. And on a very cursory, superficial basis, you'd be right. Most of the fundamentals of these conflicts have stayed the same since the 2008 Russia-Georgia war. You have a situation, a status quo in which Russia effectively controls both regions, both Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and has military bases in both. There are no international mechanisms that operate on both sides of the administrative boundary line, only on the Georgian side in the form of the EU monitoring mission. And largely the situation as the status quo has remained largely stable since 2008, with Georgia claiming these territories as being occupied by Russia, which is mostly the internationally recognized position, and Russia claiming that these places are independent sovereign states, albeit very much ones under its sphere of influence. Now, in that sense, things haven't necessarily changed very much since 2008, but the geopolitical context has changed a lot. The geopolitical context most obviously has changed with the beginning of the war in Ukraine this year, and the prospect, therefore, of a somewhat weakened Russia. But it's not just about Armenia, Ukraine. Sorry, someone's really, goodness me, never mind. Sorry, apologies for that noise. Being in Tbilisi has its downsides, unfortunately, in terms of traffic noise. Yes, so not just the geopolitical changes are not just what's happening in Ukraine, but also in the immediate region in Armenia, where Russia has demonstrated itself to be less than reliable as a security partner even to its allies. So when Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan appealed to the CSTO, the Russian-led security organization, to help it when it was hit by Azerbaijani forces, even within its internationally recognized borders, Russia's reaction was basically, let's go and talk about it, which understandably for the Armenians left them rather upset about the lack of support they've been getting from their putative allies. And then thirdly, Russia's reputation has been hit within Abkhazia itself. Within Abkhazia, the Russian authorities are trying to strong-arm the Abkhaz de facto authorities into giving up a swathe of territory, prime territory, on its Black Sea coast, something that the population of Abkhazia are against. So given all these factors, Russia's power has hit some sort of walls in the region. Firstly, the general geopolitical situation of the Ukraine war, the reduction of its reputation in the region for various reasons. You think this is the prime opportunity for Georgia to change its policy and for Georgia to be more active in terms of trying to solve the conflicts. Not necessarily in terms of reintegrating these territories as part of its own territory, but perhaps, in other more softer ways, for example, increasing peace-building activity or establishing economic links between the populations of Georgia proper and the populations currently resident within Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The surprising thing is that none of this has really happened. Georgia's policy has stayed and basically hasn't really changed since 2008. And it's a policy that I would call, sloganeering autopilot. So Georgia's policy has basically continued. They say the same things that they've been saying since 2008, occupied territories, we need to withhold recognition, but not really changing anything or finessing its policy in reaction to the changing geopolitical situation. So the question is, I suppose, why has that happened? What is Georgia's policy in these regions? And especially in a context where even Abkhazia is changing its policy. So Abkhazia in 2020, for example, actually stretched a sort of arm of dialogue out to Georgia as part of its foreign policy concept. The Abkhaz de facto president, Aslan Bajania, basically wrote a strategy which was basically involved in increasing dialogue with Georgia. Sergei Shamba, who is somewhat of a grandee of Abkhaz so-called foreign policy, also made similar remarks in 2020 that Abkhazia was open to Georgian interaction with Georgia. Of course, not integration of any sort. But Georgia's reaction to that was very passive. So the question for us, and I think the question for our speakers today, is what is Georgian policy? And more importantly, what should it be in this very changing environment? And on that note, I would like to introduce our two very esteemed speakers today. The first of which is Ambassador Archil Gegeshidze, who was appointed Executive Director of the Levan Mikeladze Foundation in November 2016. Prior to that, Ambassador Gegeshidze served as Georgia's ambassador to the United States for more than 3 years. He joined the diplomatic service from academia, working as a senior fellow at Georgia's renowned think tank, the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. More than a decade of work at GFSIS was primarily related with research and training. Before joining GFSIS, Dr. Gegeshidze spent an academic year at Stanford University as a Fulbright visiting scholar. And Dr. Gegeshidze worked for the Georgian government from 1992 to 2000, where he served as an assistant to the head of state on national security and as a chief foreign policy advisor to the president. And our other speaker, Medea Turashvili, is, we're very proud to say this, an alumna of the Eurasia Democratic Security Network and did the fellowship in 2021, and has also had more than 15 years of experience in research, analytical, and advocacy in various local and international organizations, including the Ombudsman Office of Georgia, the International Crisis Group, European Centre for Minority Issues, and Caucasian House. She has been researching conflicts, human rights, forced migration, democracy, and social transformation in the South Caucasus. She's the author of various articles and contributed to the publications of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, International Alert, the Slovak Foreign Policy Association, and the European Centre for Minority Issues, and the Carter at George Mason University. Currently, she is a PhD student at the Department of Conflict Analysis and Conflict Management at Tbilisi State University in Georgia. So both of you, I would like to thank you both for agreeing to speak today at this meeting. A few quick technical points before I pass over to Archil. First Archil will speak and then Medea. After that, we'll open this up to questions and answers from those of you who are watching on Zoom. If you do wish to ask a question, please use the hand raising icon on your screen. Or alternatively, write your question as a text. So on that note, I'd like to pass over to Ambassador Gegeshidze, who will make the first remarks.
Thank you, Alex. I'd like to begin with the words of thank you for organizing this discussion very important topic, subject, especially in these days when we are witnessing quite significant geopolitical shifts in our part of the world. And also I'd like to thank you for very, in a sense, very good introduction and setting up the stage where we stand and what is the current status of the conflicts in Georgia. It kind of eases my task. I will not go deep in describing this context. But what I'd like to start with is that, as you mentioned, 2008, when there was a war with Russia, and in the wake of this war, Russia recognized independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This was a really very important milestone in the dynamics of the conflicts in Georgia, and also dynamics in relationships between Georgians and Abkhaz and Georgians and South Ossetians. Indeed, 14 years passed since 2008, and these 14 years have been peaceful, stable years, and one may argue that these 14 years of peace should have brought positive elements into the relationships between Georgians and Abkhaz and Georgians and South Ossetians. But I would say that yes, since these 14 years have been peaceful and stable, but what has changed in the relationships between Georgians and Abkhaz and Georgians and South Ossetians is that they became even further and deeper alienated from each other, because Russia's occupation primarily has been and continues to be about keeping Georgians on one hand and Abkhaz and South Ossetians on the other hand apart, and not allowing them to find ways to bring closer their stances and their positions, and to build to start building trust. But on the other hand, and you mentioned, Alex, in your introductory remarks, that Georgia's policy has also kind of contributes to this status quo, which does not play in hands of well-being, or does not contribute to higher human security or well-being of the people living on both sides of the conflict divide. I would like to first say a few words about this external context, which since the start of the war in Ukraine has dramatically changed. And then I'll try to describe the policy of Georgian officials, the Georgian government, towards occupied territories. Yes, what we are witnessing these days, the events in and around Ukraine, and will have ramifications and its consequences on many things on our planet. But most importantly, and as we are talking about Georgia's conflicts, this war also already influences, and this war's outcome will influence definitely the existing nature of Georgian, Abkhaz, and Georgian Ossetian relationships. Now the question is, in which direction these changes may happen or will happen in the future. And of course, there is a major causality between the outcome of the war in Ukraine and the nature of Georgian, Abkhaz, and Georgian Ossetian relationships. And the reason is that the Russian factor will definitely change And here comes the major question: what this change will look like. Well, it is almost commonly admitted and believed that Russian factor will weaken, but still we are awaiting for the culmination in the war with Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine. But we all do hope, and I think that we will have good reasons for this hope that ultimately Russia will weaken. But the question is, what would be the indicators, metrics, parameters of the weakened Russia? Because there are so many variants of weak Russia in the future that it's very hard to really design a proper scenario for Georgia to prepare for, or to act in advance and get prepared for that moment in the future. Because Russia, yes, Russia has been challenged very seriously in Ukraine and rebuffed, and hopefully Ukraine will overwhelm its power, and Russia will have to leave the Ukrainian territory. There is the occupation of Ukrainian lands, both in eastern part and Crimea, will take place. But even if this happens, will it necessarily mean that Russia will have to withdraw from other post-Soviet republics such as Georgia and Moldova? And even if Russia will have to withdraw from these two republics, will it necessarily mean that Georgians and Abkhaz and Georgian Ossetians will immediately reconcile with each other? And I would like to also mention here that the occupation in the context of Ukraine and in the context of Georgia are different. If in case of Ukraine, the occupation will mean immediate restoration of the jurisdiction of Central Ukrainian government on the contested territories, both in the eastern part of Ukraine and Crimea. In Georgia's case, even if Russian troops will leave Georgian territory, and thus this notorious six-point agreement will be already fulfilled, will this mean that Georgia, Abkhaz, and Georgian Ossetian conflicts will also reach their end? And my answer to this question is that no, because unlike context in Ukraine, here in Georgia, we need to think about how to reconcile with Abkhaz and South Ossetians. In Ukraine, there is no such thing as a reconciliation as a necessity to stabilize situation in Crimea or eastern Ukraine. In our case, it is, because the conflict, the nature of this conflict, and the history of these conflicts are such that the node which needs to be the node of these conflicts which we are facing are more complex than in Ukraine. And the reconciliation thing is is a process. It's not an established fact. Reconciliation cannot be reached by signing any agreements or bilateral documents between the sides of the conflict. Reconciliation is a process. Conciliation is the state of societies where both societies no longer see each other as rivals, as contestants, as aggressors, but they see themselves as possible potential partners to deal with mutually important and beneficial issues. This context which we are having here in Georgia makes the observers feel that and most of the observers and also actors, both international actors or domestically here in Georgia, they are confused because of the ambiguity of the future, the outcomes of the geopolitical and external context on relationships between Georgians and acquired Georgians and South Syrians. Georgia's officials, they chose to wait and see what happens and what the dynamics in and around Ukraine will look like in the future, and only then to react on that situation which will emerge after Russia so-called loses the war. Since we don't know again what the weakened Russia as a loser of the war will look like, we cannot really foresee and predict what the definite scenario for Georgia will emerge and how Georgia should be ready for that possible momentum. And this is the most important factor which influences actions and or inactions of Georgian government these days. Alex has said that Georgian government's policies have been in place already many years, and with the war in Ukraine giving potential opportunities for the conflicts here in Georgia, Georgia's policies are not adapting, are not adjusting to these opportunities. I agree with you that we should be getting ready with more seriousness for that moment when Russia is no longer a strong factor in our relationship with Abkhaz and South Ossetians as it is now. Even if Russia loses and capitulates vis-a-vis Ukraine in the future, it does not mean that Russia may not opt for taking revenge asymmetrically and do more harm to Georgia and Moldova. And here's the question: what can Russia do worse in relation to what it has already done with Georgia, with recognizing independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia and keeping these breakaway territories away from the rest of Georgia? Now, the thing is that there are possibilities and even likelihood. Of course, I don't try to say that it is a very high likelihood, but still, Russia can do more harm to Georgia if it decides that to save the face internally with its own audience, to take revenge asymmetrically and do harm to Georgia. And this additional harm would be annexation of South Ossetia, where the ground is quite fertile for that, because more than half of South Ossetians, they do support joining their kings across the Caucasian range. And what is left is just a political decision on the part of Russia to annex this territory. And here again, Georgia is deprived of any meaningful tools and resources to prevent this from happening. So unless Russia is weakened to an extent when Russia is no longer able or capable to do harm to its neighbors, and first and foremost to Georgia and Moldova, then have to await any negative developments here after the war is over about Ukraine in the future. So I'll finish here, and we'll be ready to answer the questions if these questions in the audience will pose to me. We have to. The time is not on our side, and even now, when there is so much ambiguity about the outcome of the war in Ukraine, Georgia should seek every possible ways of direct contacts, of direct dialogue with Abkhaz and Ossetians. You mentioned Aslan Jania's and Sergei Shamba's initiative a couple of years ago about having direct talks with each other. I think that only these direct relationships and more flexible policies towards occupied territories could allow Georgia to take the opportunity to transform these conflicts to more civilized nature and thus build the grounds for serious political talks in the future for the comprehensive settlement of the conflict. Here I'll stop and ask you to move to another speaker.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gegeshidze. That was very, very informative, and there were some really interesting things that are food for thought, really, for all of us, actually. I mean, firstly, around the reminder that we shouldn't completely drink the Georgian Kool-Aid on the conflict. Yes, these regions are occupied, and we should see them as such, but they're also there are also conflicts with Abkhazia and South Ossetia that are aside from the Russian factor, and that if Russia were to disappear tomorrow, these conflicts, unlike in Ukraine, would still exist, and we need to remember that. And your characterization also of Georgia's policy as wait and see is an interesting one. On the one hand, that it's possible, as you say, there's the risk, that Russia will lash out even after losing Ukraine and annex these territories, and that would make this policy of doing very little actually a rational one. But on the other hand, there's also the risk, as you also very well put, that time is not on our side. And that waiting and seeing could lead us to being left behind, And I think that's a very interesting way for us to move on to our second speaker, Medea Turashvili, who, I suppose my question on the back of that is, if that is Georgia's policy, is that the right one? Is that caution doing very little the correct policy, or should Georgia be doing more to reach out and to take advantage of this moment? To build relationships across the administrative boundary line.
Thank you, and hello everyone. It's indeed my pleasure to be here, and thank you to Mr. Gegeshidze for laying out the background and context analysis for what I wanted to talk about. And I think that indeed will have quite a logical, I will try to kind of logically continue the discussion. Yet I would like to I totally share observations that was already mentioned by Mr. Archil, but I would like to share a few more points, or rather maybe make the discussion a bit comprehensive about the context, and then talk about Georgia's policies. I think Mr. Gegeshidze as well outlined that, in fact, the conflict in Georgia is three-dimensional. It's Russia, international dimension, Russia versus West, and how it actually has its impact on interstate conflict, that is Russia, Georgia, and how this interstate conflict itself is affecting intra-state conflict, that is Georgian, Abkhazian, and Georgian, South Ossetian conflict. And indeed, all these levels makes the whole situation very complex and difficult. And it was mentioned that 2008 was kind of turning point, and since then we can indeed say that the Georgia's policy was kind of non-recognition, emphasis on hard security and prevention of legitimization of de facto authorities and structures. After Russian invasion of Ukraine, Georgian government, I think, had mixed messages about its relations with Russia, Ukraine. Sometimes it raised eyebrows. Sometimes, there were statements that made sense, but sometimes it was not all clear what the government was alluding to. Yet there was a clear commitment by the government not to use force. But we can also say that now, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think the Georgian policy vis-a-vis its occupied regions, the policy is paralyzed. And I think, Mr. Gegeshidze also put it very well, that it's kind of deadlock. And another thing is, I think, something that is very important, because Russia is an existential threat to Georgia. Amidst this aggression, I think that Georgia cannot afford to be left alone vis-a-vis Russia. And Georgian government and ruling party representatives really need to seek very close alliances and partnerships with our Western partners. This would include also desisting from futile narratives about EU pushing Georgia to open the second front. I think now it's the worst time for the Georgian government to kind of prioritize narrow political party interest and score setting with the opposition over the Georgia's national interest, which is the candidacy status and accession to the EU. This is, of course, a strategic national interest, and the Georgian government should do everything for this, and this will have impact also on Georgia's peace policies towards its occupied regions. It was also mentioned that at the time is running against Georgia, and some analysts also suggest that the war in Ukraine might last longer. So this situation of paralysis, it's damaging, it's harmful, and I don't think that Georgia can afford to do kind of nothing in this situation, or to do very little. And when I'm talking about Georgia and different options that Georgia should do, here I mean Georgia as a government, as a ruling party, as an opposition parties, and as a society as well. So in this changing environment, I think that indeed, like, genuine peace and talking about genuine peace is essential, and meaning towards Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Let me say a few things that would be really crucial in this situation, in this changing environment. And this was already discussed, the changing environment was already discussed by Mr. Gegeshidze. I think acknowledging the agency of the society and the leadership of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is important. Acknowledging that people living on those territories have their grievances, fears, interests, limitations, aspirations, and these things are not going to disappear even if Russia's role is diminishing in this region. And therefore, this also urges the necessity of trying to establish direct contacts and direct communication channels with Abkhazian and South Ossetian leadership. Georgian government feared for many years, and particularly, after 2008, Georgian government feared that direct contacts and communications with de facto leadership would legitimize de facto authorities, and that would contribute to the state building of these entities or international recognition of these entities. These fears were always exaggerated, but now I think these fears are not even valid anymore, because there is no prospect of any international recognition or some kind of international legitimization of de facto authorities or these entities. For instance, very recent thing, Kremlin is forcing Abkhazian de facto authorities to transfer a huge piece of land of Abkhazia to Russia. And actually, Abkhazian society is resisting. And we have always been asking if there are any direct or indirect communication channels between Georgian and Abkhazian leadership to protect their common interests. And the common interest is to protect and to avoid that the piece of land is transferred to Russia. I mentioned, and I mentioned about the fears, grievances, and interests of Abkhazians and Ossetians, and how to address them. I think addressing these fears and grievances and interests would be really very important in this current situation. It has always been important, but in the changing circumstances, I think this is one of the kind of ways how we can have some kind of leverage over this relationships with Abkhazians and Ossetians. And again, when I'm talking and suggesting that we need to address these fears and grievances, I mean we as a state, as a government, as an opposition, as a society. I think that first of all, we need to be very consistent in the commitment to non-use of force. Non-use of force against Abkhazia or South Ossetia. Statements, Georgian government did made the verbal commitment recently after the Russian aggression in Ukraine. However, the speculations about the possible second front is damaging and adding fears. And actually, Russian propaganda is using this very well to spread the fears in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The same would go for the opposition as well, which should be equally committed and careful of what they say, how they say. We've had situations when opposition politicians made really dramatic statements that added fears in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia, fears of resumption of war and Georgia's non-commitment to the peaceful resolution of the conflict. And words create realities, right? So in this regard, talking about genuine peace that Georgia wants to embrace with its citizens in Abkhazia and South Ossetia is very important. Peace is not only the absence of war, right? It's a long, painstaking process of achieving equality, justice, social justice, democratization, rule of law, etc. And I think in Georgia, again, both in the government, in the society, in the opposition parties, together, we really need to envision the peace, how the peace looks like even after Russian withdrawal. How will be the power sharing? How societies, Georgian, Abkhazian, Georgian, South Ossetians, that have been divided by bloody wars and traumas will communicate with each other, right? So I think this is not only thinking about the peace, but envisioning the peace, how this will look like in reality. As I mentioned, using all available channels of communications or establish new ones to offer maximum opening for residents of Abkhazia and South Ossetia to trade with the rest of Georgia, to travel and study abroad. This will open opportunities for more personal people-to-people interactions. We have been talking quite a lot about status neutral forms of engagement, which might not offer like immediate alternative to Russian domination, but I think that in the medium and longer term, they will open the space for cooperation and trust and consensus, both on the societal level and also on the political level. I think prioritization of promotion and protection of human rights and human security in Abkhazia and South Ossetia is very important. This will require the expansion of international engagement in those regions. Particular attention should be paid on the rights of residents of Gali and Akhalgora regions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, because the residents of this region, largely ethnic Georgians, residents of occupied regions, for a long time have fallen victims to terror and discrimination on ethnic grounds. So this is very important to show that Georgia cares about the human rights and human security in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, for residents of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, not only for ethnic Georgians that are remaining there, but the whole society that are remaining there. And I think also learning lessons from the past and history would be very important. Georgians, Abkhazians, and South Ossetians coexisted peacefully for centuries, but Soviet nationalistic policies and rise of nationalism in early 90s pitted them against each other. So what is it that we can learn from our history of peaceful coexistence, and what is it that we can learn from our mistakes of 90s? Well, I could go, I think I could go longer, because the list of grievances and joint interest, in fact, of Georgians, Abkhazians, South Ossetians is longer. But for the sake of time, I'll stop here, and I'll be glad to answer your questions to elaborate on what I have just talked about. And I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Medea. That was a great overview of lots of different things. Actually, there's a lot in there. I mean, firstly, you said it's the worst time for narrow-minded policy. Very strong wording that we can't afford a do-nothing policy. So very strong on that. Also, the stuff on acknowledging agency about Abkhaz and South Ossetians. It's like, as I think, as Archil was sort of hinting at as well, we shouldn't go too far down the road of drinking the kind of Georgian Kool-Aid on occupation and just being just Russia, Georgia. It is also about acknowledging the agency of people there. And the thing is actually, you know, up the we see now, as you rightly put, you know, Abkhaz resistance to Russia in Abkhazia now, which is the stuff of Georgian dreams, really, to coin a phrase. You know, and you know, why isn't there more policy work going on to encourage, you know, perhaps, you know, of the two axes in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the kind of pro-Russia, you know, Russia sort of neo-colonial side, I guess, and then the converse, more independentist side, you know, encouraging the one that's more likely to lead to good results for both Georgia and the people in this region. So that's very good. And, you know, the stuff on non-use of force as well, you really underlined under that, and then underlined the importance of opening opportunities for these people based on, you know, their agency and where they are, you know, in terms of non-status or status neutral forms of engagement. You know, and for me, as I guess the person coming from a democratic security perspective, you know, anything that, you know, Georgia can do to be more attractive through being more democratic, being more open institutionally. And I think what you're saying is that would help in terms of moving the conflict in the right direction as well. So thank you very much. There's a lot of very good points there. And so on that note, I would like to open this up to questions from the audience. If you would like, I'll reiterate how this works. If you would like to ask a question, raise your hand using the hand raising button on your Zoom, and you will be asked to unmute, in which case you then press unmute. So yeah, who would like to ask? And alternatively, you can also type it in if you're shy into the chat, and I will read out the questions. So are there any questions? Anyone would like to make an opening question for our two guests? Well, that's quite a you sound that you're both being very comprehensive. There aren't any questions yet, so I can see unless I'm getting this wrong. Just scrolling through the audience. And I guess maybe I'll start with the questions to kind of warm things up. I was, as I was saying before, about the kind of two axes within societies. Unfortunately, the kind of pro-Georgian axis within both of these societies mostly were kicked out. They were mostly refugees now. But there is a kind of a division in both these societies between the kind of Russian side, Russian-oriented people who want integration with Russia, mostly the elite or the military of these places, and those who genuinely actually do want independence. And I guess the question is, I think it was one of the questions that we asked at the outset, actually, is Georgia's future policy best served by actually being the hope for these people in terms of being the kind of the easiest way for Abkhazia and South Ossetia to get the maximal amount of independence that they can get, not just from Georgia, obviously, but from Russia. Is there opportunity? How can Georgia, for example, work, with the stuff going on in Abkhazia at the moment, for example, with this land issue, which has Abkhazia basically, Abkhaz society opposed to both its own government and Russia. What can Georgia do practically to kind of reach out to that constituency and kind of build bridges? Like, if you're the Georgian government, what do you do to encourage that? So yeah, either of you can answer first, but I guess we should go to Archil first, I think, because he was the first to speak. So Archil, would you be able to quickly?
The so-called national projects in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they differ. You mentioned that Abkhaz are more kind of pro-independence, and South Ossetians are kind of already ready to join North Ossetia if allowed. So this is the primary difference between these two contexts. But what the policies of Georgian government should be these days is, and the level and the degree of dependence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia on Russia has gone up very significantly over these 14 years since 2008. Now the policies of Georgia should be to bringing down this high degree of dependence on Russia, somehow to try to detach Abkhazia and Russia and South Ossetia and Russia, and when Georgia government's official policies are, as it is stated officially, about de-occupation on the one hand and engagement with, on the other hand, with Abkhaz and South Ossetian societies. The primary challenge the Georgian government faces these days is how to demarcate these two approaches of de-occupation and engagement, so that they do not intervene as it happening these days. How to make the occupation and engagement harmonize and synergize rather than intervene and just working towards inaction or in other words, do nothing policies of Georgian officials. The Georgian officials are afraid of the prospect of international community maybe weakening its support to its territorial integrity if Georgia engages directly with the Abkhaz de facto authorities or some saying de facto authorities. And in order this not to happen, Georgia opts for sticking to status quo and again to wait and see how the big actors around would change the dynamics in Georgia's favor. And in Ukraine, what is happening these days is really cultivating hopes here that possibly the geopolitics, the new emerging order in our part of the world is directed towards that opportunistic situation for Georgia. That's why let's wait and see to what extent Russia will weaken. So and only then we'll decide on ourselves how active we should be in moving forward, either towards reconciliation or resolving the conflict altogether. So this is a primary fear of Georgian authorities, that not to allow international community to soften its support of its territorial integrity. That's why annually Georgia is submitting a resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, which is purely humanitarian, but of course with a political context, because this is the only anti-Russian resolution, annual resolution within the UN. So every year, Georgian diplomacy is aimed at securing greater numbers of supporters to this resolution, and lesser numbers of those who are against. And every year is declared that Georgian diplomacy has reached another victory, and so we are so good that more and more countries are supporting this resolution. But the fact is that this resolution, or whatever Georgian government does, for example, this program on referral, on providing free medical services to the residents of Abkhazia and Ossetia, which has been in place since 2008, and which already has more than 15,000 beneficiaries. This is a really very good program, but unfortunately it's not sufficient to change the big picture and to change the moods in Abkhazia or in South Ossetia, because big picture remains unchanged. And what it looks like these days, the alienation of communities living on both sides reaches alarming proportions, as I already mentioned. 54 rounds of Geneva international discussions have not been able to help restore mutual confidence. The image of enemy is in the face of Georgia is getting stronger in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Effects of abductions, tortures, and even murders of citizens of Georgia continue. In the Gali region, children are not allowed to receive education in their native language, and the movement along this dividing line is unstable and extremely limited. So the bottom line here is that whatever Georgia does not really bring a desirable change of the big picture. There is no trend, a tendency of two sides getting closer to each other. So this is a primary source and reason of Georgian government's policies being so much passive. Another reason is polarization, which takes place these days in Georgia, political polarization, I mean the struggle for power. And lately this polarization has acquired very pernicious feature in nature. And another source of fear has emerged from this polarization, fear of the ambushed opposition. If Georgian government becomes more flexible and offers out-of-the-box thinking and tries to soften its isolationist policies towards Abkhazia and Ossetia, then the opposition, of course, will take this chance and use this against the incumbents at the next general election. So this is another fear which holds back the Georgian government to move forward with more innovative and bolder policies with Abkhazia. And I think that the passivity of Georgians in responding to the calls from Sukhumi about direct talks also comes from this fear that if the Georgian government would engage directly with de facto administration, then of course the opposition would use this as a counter argument for incumbents and why to bring additional headache, and that's why they don't they try to again stick to this status quo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gegeshidze. From a very slow start, we've now got a queue of 4 questions coming now. So I'm going to go quickly to Medea to answer the question that was already there, but quickly if possible, because we've got to fit in everyone else. And just to remind you what the question was, it was basically, is Georgia now effectively the best hope for people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia who do want more independence or want independence to have some form of genuine self-determination? Is that where we are now? And if so, what can Georgia do to kind of build bridges with that contingent of Abkhaz and South Ossetian society, rather than the contingent that wants to be in Russia, to make that more of a possibility?
Yeah, thanks. I think that now we are not, definitely at this point. However, I think we really need to emphasize that Georgia is striving to become a part of a peace project, which is called the European Union. And this is a peace project against versus, so to speak, war project, which is coming from Russia. And the reason why Georgia is aspiring to become a member of the European Union, and the reason also why Georgia is trying to democratize, to implement reforms, or has been trying to implement reforms, is to, in fact, be able to resolve differences through democratic and peaceful means. Georgia, of course, has difficulties within its controlled territories as well. There are really just ethnic groups, diverse groups living here. So this peace project, which is Europeanization of Georgia, so to speak, this is the vision that people of Georgia has, exactly because they want a peaceful development of this country. And I think that this would be like Europeanization, obtaining the candidacy status for EU candidacy status would be the best indicator for where Georgia is heading. So we are not there, but I think that if we're not there in terms of being a hope for Abkhazians that Georgia is a truly democratic country which will respect the autonomy and, genuine independence in terms of, well, I'm not talking about political independence, but at least not imposing things on them, but rather having a dialogue with them in order to understand, share grievances, interests, etc. So I think that it would be very important in terms of, Europeanization of Georgia. This is critical and crucial, I would say, for the peaceful resolution of Georgia's conflicts.
Right. So in other words, more democratization, therefore Europeanization is very much the path to better security, which music to my ears from a democratic security standpoint. So we've got 4 questions lined up, and I'm very sort of conscious of the time, so I want to make sure every one of them gets asked. I want to start with Marina, who is another one of our EDSN people. So very happy to have Marina with us today. So yeah, Marina, what's your question?
Hello, thank you very much for this insightful discussion. And I found very interesting the references that the speakers made to the Ukrainian case, and where Ukraine and Georgia where these cases are similar, but also have, both of the countries have very different also indigenous conditions of the conflict. And after 2014, I remember there has been very vivid interest in Ukraine to study and to explore the Georgian experience in dealing with the occupied territories. And we even co-authored with Medea one paper, where I mean, what could be the lessons for Ukraine to be, learned for Ukraine from Georgian experience of engagement, and how this could be. Of course, with the situation on the ground now in Ukraine, with the active warfare, I mean, this remains very distant reality. I mean, these are very, very different cases now, but still, my question is, I would be interested to hear your insight. You alluded to this already, but probably, I mean, just in some briefly to talk about this. There is a general speculation at the moment, or assumption, that Russia's posture in the region, in the Black Sea, because of it's being bogged down in Ukraine, is significantly shrinking or diminishing in the region, with the forces being redeployed from South Ossetia, Abkhazia, from Syria and elsewhere to Ukraine. So Russians being very much committed to win this war. And the assumption is there are lots of opportunities arising for also in many ways, and Russia, many would argue, losing its spoiler capabilities because of this diminishing posture. So my question to you: do you see it this way, that really Russia's leverages are diminishing in this very area that you know very well, or it's just too early to be talking about this, and its spoiler capabilities are still very significant? Do you see Georgian government sensing potential opportunities arising, from Russia's changed stance here? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marina. That's a really good question. Is Russia's leverage shrinking? Is this assumption correct, that Russia's leverage is shrinking, or is it not shrinking? I'll ask both of you to answer the question. Also ask you, I'm going to be a bit stricter now about time, so I want to make sure we get through the other three questions. So maybe limit your answers to a minute each. I'm going to give Medea the first word on this time round, this topic round.
Thank you.
So yeah, Medea, is Russia's influence shrinking?
Thank you, Marina, and it's great to see you. And thanks for joining this seminar or workshop. I think it's too early to say, and I think that if we look at the developments in Abkhazia, and particularly, I mentioned this case about Russia government forcing Abkhazia to transfer the piece of land, which is like for Russia, this is a tiny piece of land which it shouldn't be bothered in a way, rationally thinking in this moment of time when it has a large-scale war going on. But we see that it is not giving up its interest and its presence and its omnipresence and dominance in Abkhazia or South Ossetia. So we hope that the Russian, and actually it looks like our analysis is also like there is this process of weakening of Russia. Yet we see that it's still there, it's still omnipresent there. And when it comes to the Georgian government, I mean, I personally have been in the together with Mr. Gegeshidze, to various meetings with the Georgian government, telling them and discussing together with them that this is the situation is changing and some kind of opportunities are arising. And Mr. Gegeshidze already talked about these opportunities. So, however, from the Georgian government, I think we don't yet have the clear indication that they are ready to seize this opportunity, or at least start some kind of, bold steps to seize the opportunity. I think the Georgian government is still, I think Mr. Gegeshidze already talked about this, that, Georgian government, and I also mentioned it is paralyzed in a way.
Unmuted. So thank you very much, Medea. Yeah, Archil, very quickly, just in 1 minute, Russia's leverage, is it reducing, or is that just a Georgian dream? Say it again.
Russia's leverage is kind of lowering down, but the leverage, whatever leverage Russia retains these days, is so big still that Georgia cannot afford itself some maneuvering or being innovative and take bolder steps. Even if Russia withdraws its troops and military installations, equipment from Abkhazia or South Ossetia, Russia will retain huge financial leverage over Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And not only financial, but other varieties of influence, such as half of, if not more, the government of South Ossetia is very much closely linked with the security services from Russia, and also the security services are very strongly present in Abkhazia as well. Added to this, the continuing fear of Georgia and image of enemy in the face of Georgia, this makes, let's say, the current momentum of weakening Russian posture irrelevant for Abkhaz or even Georgian government. Both sides would opt to wait and see, because the propaganda and the information, whatever is available in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and mostly is Russian propaganda, according and under the influence of that propaganda, they do not see the inevitable loss of Russia. They still hope that their big brother may prevail, and next year, when Russia will announce another round of mobilization with bigger numbers of people to be mobilized, then nothing could withstand with that force. This is the hopes, and this is the reading of the situation in Abkhazia, South Ossetia. While the rest of the world awaits the moment X in the future when Russia capitulates, and the rest of the world sees this as an inevitable outcome of this standoff between Russia and Ukraine. But this is not the case within South Ossetia and Russia. They are, of course, disappointed with Russia initiating this war. They call it sometimes, not openly, but sometimes in private conversations, an immoral war, because what Georgians did to us, now Russia is doing this to Ukrainians. But in the same time, they see in Russia their protector against the potential Georgian aggression towards them. So the Russian posture here is still strong. It's still heavily present in this situation, and unless it really dramatically changes and gets weaker, then any discussion about Russian posture getting weak would be irrelevant these days. So we, as Medea mentioned, it's too early now to discuss this possible outcome in the future in more detail. So that's why we see wait-and-see policies on the part of Georgians and also on the part of Abkhaz and South Ossetians sticking closer to Russia.
Thank you very much, Archil. We've got 2 more questions in text and 1 more from Nana, I think, from here, but I think we'll go to the text ones first so we can kind of mix and match it a bit. So I have a question from Georgi saying, How could you explain the recent concurrence in rhetoric by Abkhaz de facto authorities and Georgian ruling party figures that some in the West try to drag Tbilisi into war and open a second front? So again, we've got 2 more questions and only 15 minutes, so I would ask brief answers if possible. So yeah, maybe first you, Archil, how would you explain the kind of the seeming confluence in rhetoric between those 2 very different sides on this kind of conspiratorial idea, frankly, of the West trying to open a second front by Georgia?
Again, I don't have access to the first-hand source of information, but what I'm hearing in the open sources and what I'm seeing and reading there is there that there really have been responsible calls from Ukraine to take this chance and open second front here in Georgia, and which was not only negatively received by the Georgian government, but also the general society, because after whatever Georgia has gone through over these past 30 years, this secessionist wars in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in 2008. So this is something which general public would never support, this kind of calls to open second front and take chance against Russia, because we know that Russia still retains enormous, colossal resources to do harm to Georgia, even now. And that's why opening up so-called second front has never been popular in Georgia. But coming back to the relationship between Georgians and Abkhazians, Georgian Ossetians, they like very much Georgian officials' stance of keeping peaceful, being peaceful and not supporting these calls, but at the same time, they are not convinced that whatever Georgian peaceful rhetoric might be these days is sustainable in the future, and Georgia may really take a chance at some point to forcefully restore state integrity. So the opening up second, the rhetoric of opening up second front is neither popular in Tbilisi or in Sukhumi or in South Ossetia. Now, how and why Georgian officials try to speculate on this topic and try to portray things as if these calls come from the collective West, not only from Ukraine. I think that because of the polarization here in Georgia, and because of this very fierce struggle for power, when some international organizations or foreign governments come up with criticism or recommendations or calls for promoting democratic reforms for Georgia, this notorious 12-point list of what Georgia needs to do in order to receive the status of candidate of membership in the EU. The Georgian government tries to keep tries to make a counter move against the collective West, and thus neutralize their calls to promote democratic institutions, saying that the West is trying to involve us, engage in West, so that in the war to open up the second front. And this is something which very unwisely is used in their message box to say that these calls are coming from certain circles from the West, so that the general public, who is really very much adamant on Georgia receiving the status of candidate member in the EU, is not that much demanding from Georgian government to promote genuine democratic reforms. And again, to my judgment, I think it's not correct and it's not wise, but this is a fact, and this is something which disappoints, maybe disappointed many of those who would be real supporters of incumbent government here in Georgia.
Thank you, Archil. So just to finesse the questions a bit before I pass it to Medea. So in terms of, obviously you also touched on this, I think, in your main talk at the beginning around the kind of rhetoric being used against Georgia, that actually there's this threat that that the West is going to open this second front. And obviously those of us who are observers of this mostly just think this is silly and conspiratorial. Is there another angle, Medea? Is it actually the fact that the Georgian government saying that actually, yeah, the Ukrainians or whoever or the West want us to do this, but we haven't done it because we believe in peace? Is that a message that, just to kind of play devil's advocate here a little bit, could actually go down well in Sukhumi or Tbilisi? Is there an opportunity there for Georgia to say, look, we could have done this, we could have done, obviously it's ridiculous, but is any of that, is there another side to this coin of this rather silly conspiratorial narrative that actually the fact Georgia is very vocally saying we will not in any case start any kind of conflict in Abkhazia or South Ossetia? Could that have any minor benefit to the situation?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the question. I think the very first thing I want to say is that, yes, the Ukrainian call to open another front was uncomfortable, but it was understandable because Ukraine is at the war with Russia, and Ukraine was trying to use all available opportunities to weaken Russia, right? It was calling NATO to intervene. I mean, I think it is nothing surprising in this. Ukraine made very bold statements in European countries, in the US. So for me, their call was understandable. Not pleasant, but understandable. What really bothers me, it's not what Ukrainians that are at war, what they say, but what bothers me is the Georgian government saying that it is West also urging Georgia to open the second front. And even if they were hoping for something to go down positively, it was counterproductive, I think, because indeed, after they started talks about it, fears started to rise in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Many people were convinced, and the image of Georgia in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, it's that Georgia is a stooge of the US. Let's be as frank as it is. That's the image of Georgia in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia. So if Georgian government says that, the West is forcing them to open another front, people get scared. And they did get scared. And, whoever is following the discussions in Abkhazia and South Ossetia would know how bad the feelings were there. And on top of it, the de facto authorities exploited this fear and tried to even advance, and cultivate on these fears to create the enemy image of Georgia. And de facto authorities, I think they just engaged in propaganda because they know that when there is a collective fear against the other, against an enemy, then it is so much easier to control your own people, you know? So yes, I think that if the intention of the Georgian government was to somehow send out the peaceful messages, then wording was very wrong.
Thank you very much, Medea. Thank you for being brief as well. Okay, so we've got two. We had Nana as well who wanted to ask a question. I don't know if your hand's not up anymore. Is it? Do you still want to ask the question, or?
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. So Nana, if you would like to ask your question.
Okay, hello, first of all, and thank you very much for interesting discussion. I am Nana Shamatawa. I represent non-governmental organization Tbilisi School for Social Research. This is an NGO with a major focus on the occupation and reintegration strategy analytical framework. And your discussion was really interesting for me in a sense that, as you already mentioned, I also see the international processes currently going on as an opportunity window for Georgia to make some important steps towards engagement with Abkhazia and Ossetia more actively than it was taking place before. But also the challenge is that, as you already pointed out, Georgian government is pretty passive in that regard. Engagement should go on in two directions. It's either government engaging actively in this process or non-governmental organizations like ours. But in the situation where there is an occupation line and on the other side of the border, the de facto government is trying to shut down any channels of communication, non-formal communication between the people living on different sides of the border. It's really hard to make any difference with the work of an NGO when there is no support coming from the government in that regard. And I think that the important and the major condition here is for the government to actively start this process and then give opportunity to non-governmental organizations to engage in that regard as well. But as we have the analytical discussion today about what could have been done, I also have a suggestion which I think may be interesting for this discussion, and I want to hear your take on that. A couple of days ago, Pate Zakharishvili, representative of non-governmental sector in Georgia, he made a statement that it will be a really positive shift in the relationships between people living on a different side of borders for Georgian government to recognize the Abkhaz passports people have on the Abkhaz side as internal Georgian ID. And this step is important in many regards. First of all, from the perspective of international law, we have obligations towards people living on the occupied part of Georgia, as we consider this part and people living there as our citizens. And also it will be a really huge step towards engagement and getting into more active relations between Georgians and Abkhaz people. We know from that after war started, many people started to requesting to get Georgian citizenship, and amongst these people are also ethnic Abkhaz people. And I think that this will be a very important strategy towards getting in closer ties and making Georgia more interesting for ethnic Abkhaz and to get to the other side of the border and engage in economic or political life here. And what do you think about it? How important you think it might be for this process? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nana. That's a very interesting and good question. The question of, is it time for Georgia to kind of set aside its kind of over attachment to kind of the accoutrements of sovereignty or non-recognition, conversely, actually here. And is it time for Georgia to recognize, for example, documents issued by Abkhazia or South Ossetia as a way of getting better engagement with people in these territories? And just to give some context, Pate Zakharishvili used to be the minister in the early era of this government, 2012 and I think 2014, I can't remember exactly. So he's a very big figure in the conflict world. He used to be the minister in charge before then and after. Since then, he's been very active in the NGO sector. So I guess first, Medea, what's your view of this proposal? Would that really help in terms of reaching out to people in these territories?
Thank you very much. I think Nana very well analyzed what could be the benefits of it, so I will not go into the details. What I want just to remind you is that the Georgian legislation already contains various clauses where it says that documents issued in Abkhazia and South Ossetia could be used for internal purposes in Georgia. So in a way recognized for internal procedural administrative procedures in Georgia, the documents like birth certificate, like marriage certificate, diplomas, etc. What Nana is suggesting, I think that would be a bold step, something that, that could be very interesting thing. And yeah, I mean, I think the discussion about that has been going on for a while, actually, some in closed circles, but also with authorities. There were some publications and, articles about it. But yes, I mean, yeah, that would be a bold step. One of them.
Thank you very much, Medea. Yeah. So, Archil, do you agree? Would it be a bold step, or is it too risky?
I would like to say that Ata Zakarishvili has other suggestions as well, not only recognizing the Abkhaz passport as an internal document for Georgia. And I do support most of those propositions and recommendations. When it comes to, for example, car plates, why not to recognize car plates issued in Abkhazia, and why not to allow the cars which have this Abkhaz car plates or subsequent car plates to move around the rest of the Georgia? To my knowledge, they are the cars with Abkhaz plate. They are restricted only with the region, not further. And why not to allow them to travel all around Georgia? As it comes to the passport, I also would agree to recognize the Abkhaz passport as one of other internally issued documents in order that, as Medea said, to use it for receipt of the different services that Georgian government provides, including health or education or others. But as it comes to the issue of Abkhaz passport being an international travel document, and here is the problem. Georgian government cannot do this because if a person travels with Abkhaz passport, which is recognized by Georgia, then responsible country, if anything happens with the holder of that passport abroad, being a victim or being just a criminal, behaving as a criminal, the responsible side would be Georgian government, Georgian state, not Abkhaz, because he or she with Abkhaz passport would travel with the name of representing Georgia. That is something which the Georgian officials cannot agree with. But to recognize Georgian Abkhaz passport as internal document for providing holders of this passport different government services, then that's okay. Of course, this can be done. But I think that these days Abkhaz, they demand, they ask for recognizing Abkhaz passport as a full-fledged document, including as an international travel document, so that Abkhaz who wants to fly to Paris with cheap ticket from Kutaisi could use its Abkhaz passport and buy a ticket and just fly out to Paris. This cannot happen because, again, as I said, the French border guards would not allow that person to enter France, because this is not supported by the Georgian government. And the Georgian government cannot recognize, as I said, internally issued Abkhaz passport as an international travel document.
Thank you, Archil. Well, it sounds like we've got some consensus on this subject. It sounds like, the recognition of Abkhaz and Ossetian documents seems to be something that people think would be helpful. And from my experience, when I've had an exchange with people from these regions, I can't say I've had lots of exchanges, but those that I've had, they do bring this up. It's like, well, if you want us to have nice relations, then why don't you recognize who we are? Why don't you recognize our documents? You know, so it might seem symbolic, but it's a symbolic gesture that actually could mean something to people in these territories and could give them practical benefits, and promote sort of economic integration and peace building. So that's very good. There is actually we've kind of run out of time in terms of what we were scheduled to have. There was one other question in the text, and maybe we can answer it very, very quickly in maybe one sentence each before we finish, or maybe 2 sentences, but really keep it very brief. And the question is, what do you both think of South Ossetia's attempt to hold a referendum to join Russia back in the summer? Do you think the proposal was a genuine act to unite with North Ossetia, or was it a political ploy? So, Medea, was it a genuine attempt, or was it a ploy?
I think it was internal power struggle in South Ossetia, and if we remember the context that this was made, you would remember that in fact the previous de facto president came up with this idea hoping that he would consolidate support to his candidacy in the run-up of the elections. So I think it was just an internal thing, first of all, and secondly, I think it was the idea that was not pre-agreed with Moscow. So I think that, of course, I cannot provide the evidence of it, but afterwards we also hear the reactions from Kremlin, who at that point seemed not prepared for the annexation of South Ossetia. So I think it was an internal thing, which didn't work out.
Thank you very much, Medea. And very briefly, Archil, very, very briefly, so internal political ploy, part of South Ossetian sort of village politics, I guess. Was it just that, or was there something else going on? But very quickly.
At that point in time, in summer, it was a political ploy, but this is something which is a kind of a Damocles sword hanging above us, and we have to be really careful, because a referendum which we are talking about, it would not be necessary to hold, because Ossetians already did hold a referendum on that subject issue several years ago. So the question is, if and when the Russian government and Putin personally would wish to use this punishing or punitive measure against Georgia and decides to annex territory, because all formalities inside or locally in South Ossetia are already finished. Referendum, the genuine support of this act of joining North Ossetia is also in place. More than half of the population they do support this. So there will be no protests in the streets, and why are we joining Russia? Why Russia is annexing us? Nobody will go out in the streets and will protest it. So the ground is very ripe there for effectual annexation. But it comes to the political expediency. To what extent Russia, Kremlin may think that the time has come to use this punitive measure against Georgia. That's it. That's why I call it Damocles sword, constantly and permanently hanging above our heads. And we have to be really very careful. And that's why some of the motivations of pursuing these wait-and-see policies is also this fear of potential annexation of South Ossetia.
Thank you very much, Archil. And on that rather grave note, unfortunately, we're going to try and bring this to a close now. Thank you all very much, especially to both speakers, Medea and Archil, for very, very interesting insights. Hopefully we've pushed the conversation forward somewhat. And thank you to all of you who've come to this meeting. This whole proceeding here has been recorded, so it will be on YouTube as well. For if any of you had to leave or didn't quite catch something, you will be able to re-listen to watch this conversation on YouTube.